now that we have Rawls' position on the table and his arguments for it, or at least his basic argument, I want to talk about objections to Rawls and some responses. Some of these objections I think Rawls has pretty good responses to. Rawls is a smart guy. He has something to say to all of them. There's some of these I'm going to press on a little harder as we go on, though. We'll take a first pass at one of these today, and Nozick will press harder, at least on one of them, or at least a variation on one of them as we get into, his position next time. Okay, so one common objection to Rawls is that his theory is utopian in a bad sense. If you don't know what the word utopia means, don't run to your dictionaries. But you can if you want. But basically, this just means utopia means like a paradise, something like the world in the Star Trek series, right? Or whatever. So utopian also can mean pie in the sky, unachievable, something that looks good on paper but doesn't work, right? Basically this is a nice little sci-fi story like the world, the Federation, and Star Trek, but come on, Rawls, no society that follows these principles is actually ever going to exist. Your principles, this objection says, are not practical, they're not realistic. Well, why say this? Well, one reason to say this is just that no society has ever lived up to Rawls's principle. There's been no human society that has existed yet that has fully satisfied Rawls's principles of justice. Even the sort of Scandinavian social democracies that someone like Bernie Sanders likes so much that I think someone like Rawls would look to as an idea too, even places like Sweden and Norway don't satisfy Rawls's principles, right? There is not perfect, real equality of opportunity in Sweden or Norway. I have friends who live in Sweden. I know this, right? It still matters who your parents are and who your connections are. Maybe not as much as it does in the States. I don't know. But there's not perfect, real equality of opportunity there, right? And, look at the highest earners, right? There is much less of a gap between the people who earn the most and the rest of the population in most European countries than there is in America. Britain is kind of an outlier on this, but, places like Germany or the Scandinavian countries, But still, the CEOs of major companies like, Volkswagen, trying to think of other companies in Europe. I'm blanking on any but the German ones. But, look, even there, even in these European social democracies, the heads of major corporations earn tens of millions. They don't earn quite as much as their American counterparts, but even there, they probably earn way more than they would if all we're doing is paying them enough to encourage them to develop their talents, right? For the good of society. So even European countries that are probably a bit closer to Rawls's ideals than the U.S. is, even they don't live up to it. I can't think of any country in the world that does or has. What would Rawls say to that? If your principles are impossible to live up to, isn't that a problem? Don't we need realistic principles a society can actually achieve, can actually live up to? I think Rawls could say two things. And the first of these just is that the fact that no society has done it doesn't mean that it's impossible. For years and years and years, no human being had ever run a 4-minute mile. And it's funny, that there are all these people before somebody actually ran a 4-minute mile. Some people had actually chimed in with these very densely argued, learned papers about why human physiology was just such that it was literally impossible for a human being to run a 4-minute mile. Not like people do it all the time now. It's only the most elite runners that do this, but it's not that uncommon for people to run 4-minute miles, right? High-level athletes can do this. They said it was impossible for years. Nobody had done it. So we say it's impossible. Actually, it isn't. People have done it. People continue to do it, right? So in the same way, the fact that no society has yet lived up to Rawls's principles of justice doesn't prove that it's impossible. And I think Rawls would push on this even more. And Rawls would say, look, how seriously have societies even tried to live up to the principles of justice? No society has ever made it its goal to assure real equality of opportunity. In America, in most places, we pay lip service to it. We've never seriously made it our goal. We've tried even less when it comes to the difference principle, this idea that all inequalities have to benefit the least well off. So even if we had seriously tried, it wouldn't prove it's impossible, right? People seriously tried to run a 4-minute mile for a long time before anybody ever did. But seems, the argument against here is even weaker because no society has even seriously tried this yet. But I think if Rawls could say, look, even if it is impossible, that doesn't mean that you have to discard these principles. These principles can serve as ideals. Even if we can never live up to them perfectly, we can have them as something to work towards. We can also have them as a standard by which to judge our society. The closer we get to them, Rawls would say, the better we're doing, right? And I'm going to bet that a lot of you have ideals in your personal life, moral ideals, things like always help people in need, always treat people fairly, never lie unless there's a good reason. I'm going to bet you have moral ideals like that you don't perfectly live up to, and you might never perfectly live up to them, right? You wouldn't for that reason say, oh, this ideal is garbage. It is something good to work towards. It is something to regulate your behavior. It is something to measure your behavior by, even if you might not ever perfectly live up to it. Rawls would say, on a social scale, the principles of justice are the same way. I don't think he would even grant that it's impossible to have a society that perfectly lives up to them, but even if he did, he can still say these serve as ideals and as sort of yardsticks, ways to measure society. So I don't think this objection that Rawls's theory is utopian, pie in the sky and practical, I don't think it is a very serious objection. I think Rawls can handle it much better. A more pressing objection to Rawls, and a more commonsensical one, I think, is just to say that it's wrong to take people's income because those people have earned it, right? Here we'll focus on the rich because in a Rawlsian society, the rich are going to be the ones who really, really pay a lot more than they currently do, right? I mean, even the middle class might pay more. I don't know. Rawls is pretty radical, but definitely the rich will, right? So you might say, look, it would be very nice to help the poor, right? Everybody thinks that's great. It would be nice to have more opportunity. Everyone thinks that's great too. But to do that, you have to take money from someone. Let's say you're taking it from the rich. They'll be the most likely people to take it from. And look, don't the rich have a right to their income? Don't they have a right to their wealth? Haven't they earned it? At least some of them, right? How can somebody, I work my job, I work hard, I work it for this salary. How can you step in and take it? I deserve what I earn. How would Rawls respond to this? Well, I think Rawls' response to this is a bit more complicated, but it's pretty powerful. I mean, there might be some problems with it. When we get to Nozick, Nozick will say that there is. Nozick will push back on it, but I think it's a pretty powerful response, though it takes a few steps to see how it works. And so the first step to Rawls' response to this, well, it's unfair to take the property of the rich because they've earned it, is just to point out there are some things that nobody would give as reasons for why someone should do better than everyone else. Take race or gender or height, right? If you say, well, that guy earns a lot of money, he's getting paid more than I am, he does really well, why does he do so well? And the response you get is, well, he does so well because he's white, right? Well, in the society we live in, that really probably might play a role in how well people do, but that sure as heck isn't a justification for somebody doing better in life, right? The same with gender. Why is he rich? Well, he's a man. He's really tall. He's really good looking. See, don't you see that he just deserves to do better in life because he's a white, good-looking, tall man? No, right? We would all say that's completely arbitrary. Things like race and gender and height and looks do not make people deserve more money or to do better in life in and of themselves. Why not? 2 reasons. I think these are connected. We won't go deeply into this, but look. One is that things like this are not in someone's control, right? You don't get to choose how tall you are. Don't get to choose, your race, right? Rawls would say you have no control over these things. But more than that, they're just morally arbitrary, right? There is no good moral reason that a man should be paid more than a woman, right? There is no good moral reason that people should do better because they're white, right? There is no good reason that a tall person deserves better things out of life than short people, so on and so forth, right? It's very hard not to make some joke about the Randy Newman song, but none of you have probably heard it, so whatever. If you're wondering, Randy Newman did a song called Short People, where he actually kind of makes these points, but he does it in a very ironic way, and everybody thought Randy Newman hated short people, so he got death threats, and well, people don't do very well with irony. Anyway, beside the point. Back to the actual point, though. Rawls will say that other factors that make people better off are irrelevant to actually deserving wealth for exactly the same reasons that things like race, height, looks, gender are. Well, why is that? Let's dig into this. How might people come to be wealthy? Well, I'm sure I'm leaving out something, but 2 ways occur to me off the bat, right? People might inherit wealth and they might earn it through talent and hard work, right? I mean, a lot of people, it's some combination of these, right? There's a lot of people whose parents were wealthy. They're also really hardworking. They earn even more, But one or both, one of the other of these, or maybe some combination of them, I think explains. Maybe I'm leaving something out here, but explains a lot of wealth, right? Well, let's look at both of these in turn. What about inheriting wealth? If you inherit money, should that mean that you deserve that money? Well, to a large extent, inheriting money is out of your control, right? I mean, look, if your uncle or your, brother or whoever really likes you, that might be within your control, so you get left in their will, right? But it's largely out of your control whether you have a rich uncle or not, right? If people got to choose, everybody would choose to have probably not even just a rich uncle, probably a rich father or mother, right? If you have a rich relative, maybe you can try to get in their good graces so they'll leave you money, but it's out of your control whether you have a wealthy relative or not. You don't get to choose that. And it's also odd to think that having a rich relative means that you deserve to do better in life, right? You inherit a lot of money, you're going to do better in life probably than somebody who doesn't. But why in the world should having a rich ancestor mean you deserve to do better in life? It's actually kind of funny here. You'll hear conservatives, when people make arguments for reparations for slavery or taking the lands of Native Americans, conservatives will make this point. They'll say, look, that is just horribly unfair to punish me for the actions of my ancestors, to say that I owe money, that I owe a debt for what my ancestors did. You can't punish me. You can't say that I owe a debt because I don't have any control over what my ancestors did. It's also not like guilt is passed down like whatever, right? Well, the funny thing is, I think Rawls would agree, but he would turn this around on conservatives. He'd say, look, y'all are right. You are not guilty. You don't owe a debt for what your ancestors did. You also have not earned any merit for what your ancestors did. You might not deserve, you're right to say you don't deserve to be punished. You don't deserve to have to pay a debt because of what your ancestors did. But by the same logic, you don't deserve a reward either. The same logic that you use against reparations works equally well against inheritance. Neither way do you have any control over what your ancestors did. Neither way have you come to deserve being treated better or worse, being rewarded or punished. You don't deserve an inheritance any more than you deserve to pay a debt. Now it's interesting. When we get to Nozick, even though Nozick takes a very recognizably conservative position economically, Nozick will actually, if you push him, I think have to be much more open to the idea of reparations than Rawls is. Rawls will just say, well, the past doesn't matter. You don't control the past, and if it's the distant past, it's not like guilt or merit passes down. Nozick, because of the position he takes, I think will insist that the past matters in a different way than Rawls. And unlike Rawls, I think it's going to be hard for Nozick to avoid saying that reparations are justified. It's interesting to see why that is, even though Nozick takes a much more recognizably conservative position. All I'll say now is, when you get down to it, it's a very natural result of taking property rights seriously. Anyway, that's kind of an aside. Let's get back to the main line of charges in response to Rawls. So, wealth, inherited wealth out of your control, also morally arbitrary. You don't, in some deep sense, deserve it. But Rawls will say, look, talents are likewise out of your control. And what do I mean by talents? I mean things like intelligence, creativity, athletic talent, musical or artistic talent, right? All the things that get you paid really well in our society, whether it's, the ability to do well enough in school that you get in med school and you have steady hands to be a surgeon, or it's the ability to be incredibly good about sinking shots that no one else can in basketball, or throwing a wicked curveball, or writing a song that everyone loves, right? These things all stem from talents, these things that some people can do that other people can't do or just can't do as well, right? And having the talents that society values is a way to get rich, right? Well, but Rawls would ask you, where do your talents come from? Well, when we talk about drugs, people reliably will say, well, people aren't responsible for doing drugs, or at least the responsibility is diminished because that's really strongly genetic. Well, guess what? Talents also have a really strong genetic component. If you are tall and, have the other talents that make people good at basketball, there's a pretty good chance your children will be better than average at basketball, right? Musical talent pretty clearly also seems to be pretty inheritable, right? Look at the Bach family. Bach, this famous classical composer, loads and loads of his children and grandchildren were also fairly well-respected composers. I don't think any of them ever lived up to the level of the elder Bach, but they're pretty good, right? Why? Well, part of it's just dad's musical talent was passed down, right? Good at math, that also seems to have a genetic component, right? So a lot of talents are genetic. But a lot of the rest are going to be environment, right? If your parents provide, if you have some natural talent for music, but you're lucky enough to be in some environment where the schools have music classes, where your parents pay for music teachers, so on and so forth, you are going to develop that talent a lot better than somebody who goes to lousy schools whose parents don't have any money to pay for outside teachers, right? Same for, say, you're a great computer programmer, right? I mean, it actually is. If you look at Bill Gates, part of the reason he could do so well is he got lucky, right? He's a smart guy. But he just happened to be in one of the first school districts that offered computer programming when he was a kid, and it offered it before the other school districts did, right? If Bill Gates had been somewhere else, in some school district like mine that, didn't offer computer programming, I mean, we did, but it was a complete joke, You had your Radio Shack computer from the 70s, and you could teach it to print the same thing out on the screen 50 times. Great programming class, right? Had Gates been in a situation like that, or in a school that didn't have programming at all, he wouldn't have been situated to take advantage of the opportunities he did. And that was pure luck. Why could Bill Gates develop his talents to be a good computer programmer? Well, part of its environment. Do you control your environment? Especially when you're a kid, right? You don't. I mean, as an adult, you have a fair amount of choice of where you want to move. You have to be able to find a job there, support yourself. But as a kid, you're pretty much stuck wherever your parents are, right? Your environment is not in your control. So genetics, arbitrary, not in your control. Same for environment. Especially as a child, your parents control that. And again, these things are morally arbitrary. If you just put it blatantly and said, this man deserves to do better in life, he deserves to be happier in life because he is smart, that just sounds weird, right? Or, he deserves to do better in life because he is just incredibly talented at baseball. For that reason and no other, this guy deserves to have more happiness, to have better prospects than the rest of us. No, that sounds weird. And it sounds weird in the same way as saying, oh, he deserves to do better in life because he's good looking. So all these talents, not only are they outside of people's control, they're also morally arbitrary in the same way that other things like race or looks or height are arbitrary. But what about hard work? What about the willingness to work hard? This seems different to me, right? This seems, I'm on board with Rawls to the extent, talents, yes, inheritance, this all does seem to be morally arbitrary, doesn't seem a good reason to think you deserve better, and it also seems out of your control. Neither of those seem to be true for hard work, though, right? Hard work is in your control. I think of when I was in high school, I didn't do as well on the SATs as I should have, right? Why didn't I do well on the SATs? Because I couldn't be bothered to study for the math part, which I knew was going to be tricky for me, right? I could have learned all those mathematical formulas. I could have drilled. I could have busted my butt. My mom really wanted me to. I would have rather played video games, right? How can you expect me to recap Trig when there's Final Fantasy to be played, right? Look, it was in my control whether I study that math, and I just didn't do it, right? I mean, my mom wishes it had been in her control, like she could have set that because I would have studied that math. I didn't do it though, right? It was in my control and I didn't do it. Other side of the coin, I did really, really, I didn't get in the college I wanted to or any of the colleges I wanted to out of high school because my high school grades weren't great. Also because I didn't work, which was also in my control. But I worked my butt off the first couple of years of college and had straight A's and transferred, right? That's also in my control. I was lazy in high school. That's in my control. I worked really hard in college. That also seems to be in my control. And not only is hard work, does it seem like it isn't within our control, it also seems not to be morally arbitrary. If I say to you, if you say, well, why should Jim do so much better in life than I do? And I cite his race or his looks or the fact he's a man, that just seems gross, right? That's just wrong, right? That's not a good reason for somebody to do better in life. But if I say, yeah, he just works like crazy. He works so much harder than you do, harder than I do. Dude's amazing the amount of work he puts in. That does not seem morally arbitrary in the same way, right? Now, I think this is a serious problem for Rawls. I think there's two possible replies. I think Rawls has good answers to other things. I think when it comes to willingness to work hard, Rawls is a little less satisfying. I mean, one thing Rawls can say, and he in fact does say this, is that the willingness to work hard is also due to genes and environment. Why are you willing to work hard or not willing to work hard? Presumably, I hope you're willing to work hard, right? But if you are, why are you willing to work hard? Rawls will say, well, we can trace that back to your genes and the environment. And I mean, look, there's definitely something to this. I went to high school. I didn't work as hard as I should have, but I always had this vague idea I should work harder, right? My parents drilled that much into me. I felt guilty for being as lazy as I was in high school. I knew kids, though, and it was a kid Robbie I was friends with. His parents didn't even guilt him for not doing his homework, right? They didn't care. Robbie was really lazy, but he was raised to be lazy, right? I know a lot of kids like that. Your environment, and what is your environment, but also to some extent your genes, probably determine how hard you are willing to work. Now look, I'm not going to get into this because we get into a deep and complicated and I think unsolvable philosophical question here, which is free will, right? Do people really have free will, or is it all reducible to things outside their control? I don't know. I am uncomfortable saying that hard work is entirely due to genes or environment because that sounds like determinism. That sounds like a claim that we're not responsible for anything. Rawls floats that idea sometimes. It's a huge claim. It's hard to establish. It would be bad if his argument depended on it. And I think a lot of us are just uncomfortable with this claim that everything is due to things outside of our control, like genes and environment. Philosophers call this hard determinism. Most people don't find it a super attractive position. I think another better reply might just be to point out that hard work is not enough to be successful, and that it's impossible to know how much of a contribution hard work makes. Look, we all know people who work like crazy who never get anywhere in life, right? Who just barely keep their heads above water. They work as much as you could want anyone to work. They probably work more than most of us do, and they just never get ahead, right? It's hard to think of really lazy people who make it big. Although some do. John Lennon, by all accounts, was incredibly lazy. Just very naturally gifted guitar player. So much so that he made it rich. But, the other Beatles were always like, John is so lazy, he will not practice. But, most people who succeed aren't as talented as Lennon. They at least need to put a little work in. But even there, it's hard to know how much is hard work and how much is luck, right? And all of us have a tendency to probably overstate how much of it's hard work. We focus on the fact that we work our butt off and get in the good college or get the scholarship. We don't notice that, we're lucky that the scholarship's there, the good college exists, right? And I mean, I go back and forth on this myself, right? I worked like crazy my first, year of college to make up for my bad high school grades and my mediocre SATs. And I got into UVA, right? Which is pretty hard to get into. I'm proud of that. That's hard work, right? But on the other hand, if UVA hadn't been a state school, I didn't do well enough to get a full ride there. If it hadn't been a state school, my parents couldn't have afforded it, right? That was luck. If I lived in some state where, the state school wasn't as good, I just, no matter, even if I could have gotten into a school like UVA, wasn't good enough to get a scholarship, my parents wouldn't have been able to afford it. I wouldn't have been able to go there, right? The fact that I live in Virginia and we have really good public colleges is pure luck, right? So I go back and forth. It's like, how much is hard work? How much is luck? It's easy to ignore the luck aspect, right? Especially if you do manage to succeed, it's very easy to be like, I'm a self-made man. It's all due to my efforts. When in fact, for most self-made people, you can point at luck playing a big role. There's a really good book by this economist, Robert Frank. I think it's just called Luck maybe, but he talks a lot about this. All right. So anyway, 2 possible replies from Rawls. The second one is the better one, I do think. That it's hard to know how much of a luck role plays. Well, the final question you might ask for Rawls, and I'm not going to get too deeply into this one because, if you guys listen to Dworkin talks about the technical aspects of Rawls. This gets really hard into the technical aspects really quickly. But you might wonder why Rawls puts so much focus on the poorest of the poor. Rawls has a technical argument for this, and it relies on decision theory, rational choice theory. Rawls is a smart dude. He knows the math with this stuff. All I'll say is Rawls' actual argument depends on some controversial claims about how to make decisions under uncertainty. If you guys ever do like the math behind this rational choice theory, you'll run across it in economics. I think you'll run across it in some math. Rawls follows the so-called maximin strategy, which means you pick the alternative that things come out the best if the worst happens. I'm going to stop talking about it now because a lot of you that don't know this stuff, I'll just confuse. If you do know the math and economics better, I'll probably say something stupid and you'll correct me on it. Suffice it to say, Rawls' technical argument for this doesn't seem to be as clearly right as he thinks. But I think there are more common sense reasons to focus on the poorest of the poor, to think about, well, what if the worst happens? And here I think it is the poorest of the poor have the most reason to object, right? If anybody gets a veto in society, if anybody gets to say these rules are bad, who would it be? The people who are doing the worst. If even the poorest of the poor, the person at the very bottom of society, could say, yes, I can consent to these principles because I'm being treated as well as possible, then I think that's a good reason. I mean, it might not be a slam dunk, but it's a good reason to think that these really are principles everyone could agree to. The person most likely to object to them and who has the most claim to object to them can't, Rawls would think, because they're doing as well as possible. That seems pretty powerful, that these really are principles everyone could agree to.